My name's Tom Keating. I'm director here at RUSI of our Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion on assessing the outcomes of the February 2022 FATF plenary. So you are clearly a nerd or a geek if you're here, but actually, from our perspective, we anticipated that this would be quite a decisive plenary, given all the things that were being discussed, and well, we can decide amongst ourselves whether it lived up to our expectations. Most of you are familiar with what we do at RUSI in our Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies, and I have to say that having a finance program in a defence and security think tank has never proved to be, unfortunately, more relevant, given the centrality of financial and economic responses at the moment to the Russian war in Ukraine. If you want to know more about us, do please visit the RUSI website, rusi.org/CFCS. And of course, you can find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. So for today's discussion, I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Isabella Chase, a research fellow in our Financial Crime and Security Studies program here, and importantly, also a keen FATF watcher. As well as David Lewis, who's now a managing director at Kroll and wearer of many other hats, an increasing number of hats, which has him traveling all over the world, but also a senior associate fellow with us here in our program at RUSI. And of course, most importantly, for 6 years until January this year, the executive secretary at the FATF. Now, I always say you can never have too many Isabellas in the room. So we're also delighted to be joined by Isabella Kaminska. She's formerly the editor of the FT's Alphaville pages, the serious but also amusing part of the FT, if such a thing exists. And now doing, well, other stuff, which I will let her explain in a second. And she's kindly agreed to moderate today's discussion. Isabella and I have had a pretty regular discussion about the response to financial crime around the world. And given FATF is central to that, we thought she would be a great moderator. So with that, I will pass proceedings to Isabella to introduce herself and moderate today's discussion.
Well, thank you, Tom. That was a great introduction. I am now fronting my own little media venture called The Blind Spot, and the objective is to focus on information or stories that the rest of the media is kind of missing out on. So that's the basic concept there. But yeah, the FATF plenary, I've got a list of directions here, and I'm asked to ask you, David, what your top level, take is on the key findings.
Thanks, Stella. So I left FATF back in January now, and as Tom said, I'd been there for 6 or 7 years. In deciding whether or not to move to Kroll, one of the things that made it easier for me to make that decision ultimately to move was I could see the direction that the strategic review was heading in, and it was due to complete, and looks like it has largely completed just last week. And it was a project that I started more than 3 years ago. So it's been a long-term project for the FATF to reflect upon what's working and what's not working in the world of financial crime, in particular with the way it assesses countries in order to have a better impact on what we call effectiveness. So not just laws and regulations, but actually having an impact on stopping money laundering and terrorist financing. And one of my key focuses was the mutual evaluation process, which at the moment takes 10, 12 years to review every country sequentially, 12 to 14 months each. And it ends up with a massive report that no one reads, and then it's updated a decade later. And it felt to me that we could make the whole process a lot more timely, more targeted, rather than reviewing the whole regime, zero in on the bits that everyone knows you need to worry about in that jurisdiction, and more risk-based generally. And I think what we see from the rather brief announcement on the FATF website on Friday is that it's been a bit of a damp squid. They discussed a lot last week, but you would have thought that the outcome of a 3-year strategic review would have merited a bit more than 4 or 5 lines on the website. And essentially what it said was, we will now take 6 or 7 years to review countries. We'll make it a more risk-based process, and we'll have a greater focus on the professions, lawyers, accountants, so on. All of that's good. The extent to which those things will be done is yet to be known. They haven't published anything, a paper yet on it. But from what I saw while I was there, it will be an incremental improvement rather than a revolution. And I guess that's not surprising for an international organization. But I think for me, it's a little bit disappointing. It means that you'll still largely see the same evaluations. They'll take a little bit less time. Maybe they won't repeat everything, all the sort of technical compliance bits. Maybe they'll focus a bit more on the key risks of jurisdictions. But it'll still be several years between meaningful updates on the measures countries are taking to address money laundering and terrorist financing. The one ray of hope, I think, in there is the opportunity for them to do thematic reviews. And I hope they take advantage of that, because we saw that happen in the context of ISIL, where they did a thematic review of terrorist financing measures around the world. And by that, I mean, they looked at all countries at the same time to see what they were doing to stop terrorist financing rather than countries sequentially. And they published a paper at the end of it. It set out where countries were, and that went to the G20. It wasn't published, but within 3 months, 50 countries changed their legislation as a result of that. And so I think where you put countries on an equal playing field and you assess them at the same time on something quite specific and meaningful, then you get, all of a sudden, you start to get results. And that's where I think there's hope for the future, but we'll have to wait and see. As of yet, it could be a bit of a damp squib.
David, that's really interesting. I find it quite surprising that they wouldn't have been doing that already. But Isabella, what were your highlights?
Thanks so much, Isabella. So for me, I suppose I had 4 main points or highlights from the statement that was made. I think, first of all, it's really important to acknowledge the statement that was made on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think for a situation where the response is so closely entangled with everything within FATF's wheelhouse, money laundering, terrorist financing, sanctions, it would have been pretty inappropriate if they hadn't made a statement. And I think what jumps out to me about it is the line where they say that they will be reviewing Russia's role at FATF. So it'll be interesting to see what that means. If there is the in-person meeting of the ministers later this year, how Russia's status at that meeting materializes, I think, will be one to keep an eye on. Obviously, as David has already said, the conclusion of the strategic review is a huge highlight for us. But I think there are also some updates on some of the more back-end parts of FATF that are really interesting, especially, as Tom says, to the real geeks in the room. So the piece on the strategic vision for the global network will be interesting to see if anything's actually published on that. But of course, FATF as a global organization is only as strong as the country, every country around the world. So what happens with the FSRBs and how they go about strengthening that global network will be really interesting to see. The third key area for me was perhaps the very muted line on the Unintended Consequences project. So this was a project that sort of an offshoot of the strategic review, I suppose. It ran for 12 months, and it was looking at the unintended consequences of the FATF system on 4 key areas. So de-risking, financial exclusion, the undue targeting of NPOs, but also on human rights. And one of the interesting things about this plenary statement was the omission of that mention of human rights in the update. There was a report released last October on the unintended consequences that did find unintended consequences of the FATF system on human rights. So not quite sure why that's missing. It also says that the unintended consequences work will now be consumed within the working groups. We really hope at RUSI that means there will still be a special focus on the unintended consequences and that they don't just sort of dissolve into the normal business of the working groups. Finally, I think it's really great to see the draft guidance document on the real estate sector. Given recent events, I think it's really been shown that it's so incredibly important to ensure the integrity of real estate purchases. So going through this process now of finalizing that guidance will be really important and interesting, but then also Of course, the guidance is only the first step. Bringing this sector along its FATF and compliance journey will be really difficult. It's a really complex sector with so many different stakeholders in it. A little resistance historically to anti-money laundering compliance. And as the draft guidance says, a really quite low level of understanding of the money laundering risk in that sector. So great to see the guidance, but now let's take them on that journey, because it's going to be, I think, quite a tough one.
Fascinating, thank you. And Tom, you've been taking a closer look at the grey listing of the UAE.
Yes. Look, I think people will be very familiar with obviously the grey listing and the grey listing process. The list of countries is growing, but normally, honestly, they're countries that are kind of far away and out of sight. The countries that end up on the grey lists. There have been some exceptions to that. So, for example, just under 12 months ago, Malta was put on the grey list. It's clearly made tremendous progress in meeting the plan that it agreed with the FATF and is deemed to have substantially completed its action plan. And so I would imagine that no one is taking bets anymore that by June this year, Malta will be off the grey list. So I suspect that will happen. And Pakistan is another one which obviously has been on the grey list for quite some time. Seems to be continuing to make progress. And I guess what interests me is that typically the concern around Pakistan has been its ability to deal with the terrorist financing issue in the country. But actually now the remaining issue is around demonstrating an ability to pursue complex money laundering investigations and prosecutions, which seems eminently achievable. So perhaps Pakistan can see some light at the end of the tunnel. One of the countries that interested me was the kind of the update on Panama. You get the sense that the FATF is pretty frustrated with Panama. I think the text reads, the FATF again expresses significant concern that Panama failed to complete its action plan. And so might Panama move on to the blacklist? Those in the know suggest that would be a nuclear option, but perhaps the language will just get stronger and stronger. And then, yes, we come on to the UAE. And I think the adding of the UAE to the grey list is it's a major event, because there you have a global financial center added to the grey list. Was it a surprise? I don't think it was necessarily a surprise, but it clearly will force financial institutions around the world to treat the UAE differently. I'm sure many financial institutions obviously were already on a risk-based basis treating the UAE or connections with the UAE with caution. But I must say, the list of actions that are listed by the FATF that the UAE needs to meet are pretty substantial. And I would say kind of long-running issues that the country has had. So, for example, with the non-banking sector, with its capability to investigate money laundering. I think a critical one in all of this is international information sharing. You can't be a global financial center and not be good at sharing information with partners around the world, or rather, if you're not good, then that's clearly a massive problem. And then sanctions evasion. And of course, the question of sanctions evasion is brought into even sharper focus at the moment, because I am quite certain that many people who suspect that they might be in the crosshairs of Western sanctions against Russia will be looking around the world trying to decide where to move their yacht, plane, money, whatever it might be. And so clearly being recognized as a vulnerability on sanctions evasion is not going to help the UAE. So the UAE, at least in our experience, has been working pretty hard since its mutual evaluation was published in 2020. Remains to be seen whether that hard work is form over substance. They've certainly got a good marketing campaign going on LinkedIn and places like that. But we've had the opportunity to engage with the authorities there on a number of topics. So clearly they recognize that work needs to be done, but there does really seem to be a lot of work that needs to be done. And then there's the implication for the international community. How do different countries interpret the grey listing? In the UK, the way it works here is that these banks now have to apply enhanced due diligence to contacts and customers and clients in the UAE, and that's going to create a huge amount of work when you consider the financial nexus between the UK and the UAE. The UK also has an illicit finance partnership with the UAE, so it'll be interesting to see how that partnership develops in light of the grey listing. Obviously, the UK is around the table at the FATF and perhaps has a reputation for being quite robust in its view of who should be grey listed and who shouldn't be. So I'm sure there'll be some interesting conversations going on in Abu Dhabi at the moment. So yeah, I think that'll be one to watch. And then lastly, I guess just to note that Zimbabwe was removed from the grey list. I'm not quite sure what to make of that, but I guess it shows that the grey list can go both ways.
Fascinating. And so now we're going to go back to Isabella, who's going to give us a brief summary of the event you held in 2019 and what experts at the time wanted to see from the strategic review.
Thank you. So of course, I'm not sure if any of you were there at the time, but back in November 2019, we held a panel event with David and a number of other experts, because at the time the strategic review had just been announced, and we wanted to sort of crowdsource what people wanted to see out of it, and now that it's concluded, whether or not their wishes have been met. So as David already said, the strategic review really set out how FATF evaluations could better promote and enable more effective and efficient money laundering and counter-terrorist financing measures in different countries. And they would do so by really interrogating every aspect of the mutual evaluation and follow-up process. Sort of some of the questions that were being asked at the time was about the frequency and the scope of different evaluations, how the methodology could be revised, and also how you can ensure consistency across the FSRBs. What our experts at the time really wanted to see, and what some of the questions they wanted asked from the strategic review, was really thinking about whether or not we get much benefit out of the huge cost of the mutual evaluation process. It's incredibly expensive for countries, and of course their private sectors have invested a huge amount of money in compliance, but what is the benefit that we see? Are we really having this evidenced impact on countering financial crime that we hope we would from all of this investment? There was also a question around the immediate outcomes. Had we just created another tick box exercise and really not understanding any better what the combating of financial crime that we were seeking? As we've heard a little bit from Tom, though, there was actually quite a lot of support back in 2019 for the ICRG process. It does bring around a change of behaviour, but what type of risk does it actually show? It's more a list of countries who have recently been assessed and have been found wanting, but isn't actually a good representative of where is the risk right now in the world. There is a number of questions also around the quality of assessments and assessors. And the event really concluded with the idea that the first 30 years of the FATF system had all been about standards, and the next 30 years should be about evidence and showing that this system works. So I guess one of the questions would be, to what extent has the strategic review moved us closer to understanding whether or not any of what we do works? Obviously, probably a little too early to tell without the updated documents, but it will certainly be interesting to see if this new fifth round will bring us any closer to understanding that.
Brilliant. So we're going to have a bit of an open panel discussion at this point, and I thought I'd kick things off where there's been a number of questions, but we'll go back to questions specifically. But you mentioned the list of countries. I think what people really want to know in the context of Ukraine and the Russia sanctions is, how does this impact the UK and London specifically? Because there has obviously been a little bit of talk about London's exposure.
Look, I think if you canvassed countries around the world and said, come up with an alternative grey list, a shadow grey list, which countries Yes, a shadow grey list. Which countries do you think, which countries represent a kind of a financial crime risk for you? And I appreciate that's not what the FATF is trying to do, but obviously the UK would be on that list. We have the opportunity to regularly talk to, used to be able to travel, hopefully again, people around the world and say, look, where do you see your financial crime vulnerabilities? I said this to many people before, but I remember one time we went to one country and we gave out our business cards, and the chap looked at the business card and he saw Whitehall on the business card, and he assumed we were from the British government. And so we got this huge lecture on the problems that the UK presents to that country before we pointed out to him that we weren't actually from the British government. So I think what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is the focus on kind of the UK's illicit finance problem has been immense. I just think every country on the planet is ringing us up and saying, can someone explain how the UK managed to get itself into the position it seems to have got itself into with, in this particular case, dirty Russian money. So I think one of the things that we had hoped to see, and be interested in David's view on this, one of the things we had been hoping to see out of the strategic review was some sort of risk-based assessment of countries in terms of their contribution to financial crime risk around the world. Because I would argue that small failings in the United States, in the UK, in other European countries are far, far more threatening than failings in Zimbabwe or in Uganda. So I don't think that, unless David has another view, I don't think we've yet really grappled with that issue.
David, do you have any thoughts?
So I guess two things. Firstly, we see a lack of interest generally and consistently in tackling money laundering, slightly different with terrorist financing. And there are things that drive national action on money laundering, and it tends to be, investigative journalism, things like the Panama Papers, or the situation in Ukraine at the moment, which has driven all the activity in the UK, or mutual evaluations. And mutual evaluations are effective in that when countries know they've got them coming up, they suddenly go, Christ, we better get ready for it. Maybe we should start doing something about money laundering. So I think regardless of what happens in the strategic review, the FATF recognise that mutual evaluation tool is incredibly powerful and will continue to do it. And maybe there's some resistance to change for that reason. But I think in terms of London grad, if you like, it's the FATF is an international organization. It's a body made up of countries. It's an intergovernmental body. It is never going to come up with a list of its own members in order of risk. You wouldn't expect any intergovernmental body to say, well, to agree that one of them is more risky than another. And although the FATF is a technical body, it exists in a political context, and there is a strong resistance to any conversation which would show relative risk between countries, or any kind of benchmarking. And this is a fundamental challenge that the FATF faces. So I don't think you'll ever see a Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index kind of thing in the AML world, the money laundering world. The system just won't support it. You would need an independent body to do that. But while I'm hopeful the strategic review will make a difference, the outcomes of it is that when FATF looks at a country, they will focus more on the risk context of that country. They already do that, but I think there's scope to do a lot more of that. And I hope that that's where they'll be going in the future. And that should result in the lists, the various lists, and the follow-up processes to the peer reviews being more risk-based, but it won't be a list of countries with the UK on the top of it.
That's really interesting. Isabella, do you have any thoughts on it?
Oh, no, I mean, I suppose the opportunity in the follow-up procedures, depending on what that looks like, will change the frequency in which countries go through these processes. And so maybe we'll take some of the heat off them. I agree. It's not necessarily helpful to create lists of 1 to 100 of who is the riskiest, because also ultimately that is up to a firm and their risk appetite. And I think also, as for people who know the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index and have interacted with it, Transparency International themselves aren't always the biggest fan of it and realize the sort of some of the beasts that they have created. And so it's not always, I suppose, the most helpful But then we also have new lists to contend with as well. The EU high risk list takes the FATF list and then adds to it. So there are other, if you need the guide, there are other lists to go to as well.
Okay. And I was very interested to hear about the fact that this human rights element was overlooked in the latest review. What do you, I mean, you had no insight into why that was, perhaps give some background also into what was said in the original kind of reference to it. What was the issue at hand?
So we do have an expert on the room on this, so I will know if I get this incorrect, but it's a lot about the due process and the impact on human rights when money laundering and terrorist financing laws or frameworks within countries are used to curtail the human rights of people, whether that be sort of like the presumption of innocence or targeting people with money laundering and terrorist financing legal frameworks when that just isn't the case, which is a trend that we see more and more around the world. Interestingly, it's also a trend that we do see in Zimbabwe, a recently delisted country, as Tom mentioned. And we would argue at RUSI and what we've done on unintended consequences, that given the huge influence of this group, of FATF, they should probably take a little bit more responsibility for the impact of how the framework is used, whether that be to infringe on human rights or to unduly target NPOs. And as it moves into its next phase, perhaps that's something they should really focus on. Difficult, considering that they don't have a strong legal basis, but really important, because these the unintended consequences categories are too important to ignore or to allow to be not taken responsibility for.
Yes, the road to hell is paved in good intentions, as they say. David, do you have any views on that?
Yes.
Especially in light, I would ask, recently we had this Canadian trucker situation. So if any insight into how that might be effective.
So it's a really tricky issue, but it's an issue and it's a growing issue. And when I was at the Secretariat, we frequently got letters of complaint from NPO, non-profit organization representative groups who were talking about oppressive regimes using counter-terrorist financing measures to crack down on all kinds of activity. And we do see examples around the world of where AML and anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing measures are used for other ends. And I think maybe the Canadian truckers example is a case of that. I'm not close enough to it. I understand it was a temporary measure, but it was a measure a bit like the UK using its Counter-Terrorist Financing Act in Iceland. There was no terrorist financing risk or terrorist risk to the UK at all from Iceland, but it was a tool they could deploy and felt that they had to use it at the time. And so I think you see increasing instances of this around the world. The challenge for the FATF is that it's not a human rights body. It's an anti-money laundering body. So the technical experts around the table say, look, we are capable and qualified to talk about whether the country is taking enough action on terrorist financing or money laundering. What we can't say is whether what they're doing on human rights is enough or not. And trying to mix the two is quite difficult. So this is the challenge that they're facing there.
Tom, do you have any thoughts?
I just had a flashback because having been an ex-investment banker who got buried by the global financial crisis, I vividly remember when Gordon Brown used the counter-terrorism financing legislation in the UK to freeze assets so that they wouldn't flee back to Iceland back in the day. I'd forgotten about that. And I had money in one of those banks. So I was delighted actually that he took those steps. But no, look, I mean, I think there are two things here. I think obviously FATF has done a remarkable job of driving up standards around the world. That is clear. And of course, as you get closer to perfection, and I'm not suggesting we're anywhere near perfection, but as you get kind of closer to perfection, obviously the things that need to get done become more and more diversified. It's not like big building blocks we're doing anymore. We're sort of doing increasingly fine tuning. And so I think as long as the FATF kind of recognizes that and adapts in such a way as it's not just applying kind of the sledgehammer to every problem, but kind of starting to use a scalpel, then I think that should be welcomed. But part of that does clearly require the FATF to identify where its influence is perhaps being misused, and then trying to address that and not being afraid to address that. And I think if it doesn't move to address that, and I appreciate it's not easy, then that kind of starts to undermine its credibility, and that I think would be a shame, because ultimately it is achieving something positive.
Yes, certainly. I will just say at this point, please do submit your questions. We'll come to them in a few minutes. One thing when I was looking through the review, and excuse me if I this sounds naive, but this is as a layperson to some degree looking at it. I was intrigued to see the note about bearer shares in reference to beneficial ownership. Did anyone else spot that? And what could you just tell me, like, what kind of bearer shares are they talking about? Because I hadn't heard of this and I thought it was quite interesting.
Well, they're banning the issuing of new bearer shares.
I thought
bearer shares were
I have to say I thought the same thing, and have done. I guess it was a legacy issue that needed to be, wasn't fully addressed, and so this was something that was long overdue.
I see. That's interesting, because I was also under the impression they were already banned. And in terms of the real estate section, obviously that is, as we were talking about London Grad, real estate is a pathway here, and they're obviously recommending that real estate agents are perhaps not as in the know about what's going on. Any thoughts about the how the review has tackled that issue, or whether there's going to be any further sort of impact from that?
I think one of the issues with real estate, and obviously countries, it's not as if countries haven't already regulated the sector. I mean, the UK has regulated real estate for a long time, and letting agents even more recently. It's not necessarily, it's useful to have this global guidance, but I think the issue is more in the supervision of the sector. And we see very different supervisory models for real estate across the world. In the UK, it's quite self-regulated, but then sits under HMRC, and it's just never been a particularly strong area. You don't have a very good relationship between the regulated population and the supervisor. That supervisor might not be the most well-resourced. So I think that's so much of the issue is, yes, there's risk, and you're going to be bringing these people into that, into taking greater responsibility for that. But it's the people who oversee the implementation of this guidance is where we're going to really need to strengthen controls, I think, because it's been a bit weak. And FATF produced their excellent risk-based supervision guidance 18-ish months ago now, but that is quite a long time coming. And so when you have supervisors, especially in the DNFBP sector, which don't tend to be the most sophisticated, being able to implement risk-based supervision and make best use of their resources is really challenging and difficult. So I think the key in the real estate sector is, yes, you need to bring the agents along, but crucially their supervisor, who will make sure that they understand their risk and are putting in the correct controls.
Well, and as we know in the UK, so let's just say, for argument's sake, that there's a half decent supervisory regime for real estate in the UK, but the problem we have in the UK is we don't actually know who owns the real estate. So I think real estate clearly is an area where there are more issues to deal with than we've managed to grapple with so far, and that then kind of blurs into the whole beneficial ownership question, because it's the challenge we have in the UK, as I say, is we don't know who owns these properties, or rather we know who legally owns them, but we don't know who the ultimate beneficial owner is. So we might want to talk a bit about beneficial ownership. But the other thing I would say is that, just more broadly, and I think I've heard David, I think I've heard you say this a number of times before, is that supervision generally around the world is a big issue. So we've got, let's just say we've got great laws, and we're meeting the FATF standards, but if we're not supervising properly, then that's all for nothing. And at least as far as I can tell, looking at the kind of heat map of consolidated outcomes of the FATF evaluations, the supervision column is the one that looks sort of most orange and red. Is that fair?
Well, bad supervision drives bad preventive measures by firms, and the results of all the FATF evaluations so far in terms of effectiveness show that 75% of the sort of 110 countries assessed need to make major improvements to their supervision. Actually, though, when you look at firms, it's close to 100% need to make major improvements to their preventive measures. But that hides, I think, a differentiation between practice in large financial institutions and certainly practice in real estate agents and the other professions. But I think one of the biggest areas FATF has to grapple with is making supervision more effective, because that will drive more effective measures by firms, and then starting to get down into the detail about what it means to take effective measures if you're a real estate agent. And that's not rocket science, but it does require that we understand who ultimately owns and controls properties in the UK. At the moment, we don't.
So given now you've referenced my specific questions, so what do you think overall the impact of the strategic review is going to be, and do you think it's sufficiently met its objectives, and where are the blind spots, so to speak, still there in the review?
Who wants to go first?
I think you should go first, David, seeing as you started. It's your responsibility.
I don't think it will have very much impact, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
As I said, one of the reasons I decided to leave is because I could see myself doing exactly the same thing and saying exactly the same things for the next few years, and that felt like a little bit of a waste of time. So I don't want to be too critical. I think they've worked really hard at trying to make it better. It is an incremental improvement. It will make the process more risk-based. The reports will come out every 6 years rather than every 12 years, which is an improvement. But I don't think it's going to make a major difference to the fight against money laundering.
Isabella?
Scathing. So obviously it's quite early to tell when if you don't have the insight of someone like David who's been in the system. Of course, we're still waiting for the big changes to the documents, methodology and the procedures. But I think ultimately, and the fact that they talk about how this is going to focus a lot more on risk. I mean, I would ask, what was it focusing on previously if it wasn't focusing on risk? But to me, the underlying problem in the whole FATF system is risk is obviously at the heart of it. So many countries struggle and so many entities struggle still with, how do I know what my risk is? How do I identify it? How do I mitigate it? So if the strategic review doesn't solve that fundamental problem of giving countries or entities the proper tools to understand their risk, you're never going to solve this problem. You're never going to make it effective, because you need to know what the risk is at the heart of it. And it doesn't seem, although there will be a greater focus on risk, that problem will be solved.
I mean, see, David mentioned this sort of rapid global assessment after the Paris terrorist attacks on, how our country is doing on terrorist financing, and I think that the FATF has it within itself to focus on risk. So, actually, onto a topic that I know you love, it has had this sort of thematic focus on crypto, for example, for the last couple of years, and it hasn't kind of waited to go through all the countries to sort of figure out what the problems are with crypto. It's kind of it's lent into that. You've got these annual updates and all the rest of it. So I suppose in a way, that's what I would like to see more of, is instead of kind of plodding through the countries one by one, let's figure out what are the vulnerabilities. Well, now let's carpet bomb those vulnerabilities globally and move away from this kind of countries lining up one by one to be assessed. And I think you could come up with, I don't know, half a dozen particular issues that there are, and then actually spend the next 6, 7, 8 years kind of just chewing through those challenges, rather than lining all the countries up and reviewing all sorts of stuff that you're probably going to find has improved a bit, but it was okay anyway. So why are we bothering spending time looking at it again?
That's really interesting. Before I open it up for questions, that kind of feeds into a concern that I think broadly a few prominent names online have been expressing about how, where is the time best served, and what are the implications if and when, you are creating excessively bureaucratic processes that are actually constraining the good people in the system and not capturing the bad stuff. Right? Has there been any acknowledgement of that? And if not, how can that be acknowledged in future reviews or processes?
So the FATF's taken the approach of same activity, same rules. So if you are involved in selling assets in which you can store or transfer value, whether you're a financial institution, Standard Chartered, or whether you're, a virtual asset service provider, the same rules apply to you. And that means that for cryptos, information on the originator and the beneficiary needs to go across the blockchain with the transaction. Now, the blockchain community will have been throwing their arms up and saying, well, that's impossible. That's not what it was designed to do. But actually what we've seen is technology providers come out and provide solutions that enable that to happen. And it's actually driven, I think, a growth in the crypto industry, because you're starting to see some responsible regulation around it. Of course, you can criticize it. And it looks at, I've heard people say that the problem with blockchain is it wasn't designed to fit financial crime rules. And that's kind of the way that FATF's looked at it. Instead of going, well, how can we design financial crime rules that work well with the blockchain? It said the blockchain, the world has to change to fit us. Mm-hmm. And that may over time prove to be rather limiting in terms of opportunities as well as risks. Interesting.
But just on that, I suppose the new Singaporean president, it could be a really encouraging step. We know that the Monetary Authority of Singapore is one of the most innovative regulators that we have around the world. So maybe bringing some of that culture to FATF will be really interesting when approaching new technologies over the next couple of years.
I hope so. You can't sort of overestimate the role of the president, because it's an international organization. They chair the meeting, and you still have to get consensus among 39 countries, where you've got Russia and China and the UK and France. That's whoever's sitting at the head of the table, it's going to be difficult for them.
Okay. Tom, any other thoughts?
Well, you just, David just kind of rattled off a list of countries that I think we can increasingly see are kind of not agreeing on things. So I do wonder how geopolitics might kind of play into to all of this as well. We've unfortunately passed sort of peak agreement, and I'll be very interested to see how the fabric of the FATF develops in the coming 6-9 months, because it is clearly influenced by politics, and politics is getting strong.
Definitely the case. Does anyone in the audience here have a question? Hands up if you do, and don't be scared, because I know the first question could be no over here. Yeah.
Hi, David Artingstall, Associate Fellow at the Centre here. I wanted to pick up on something that Isabella mentioned earlier, which is the disappointing unintended consequences, well, certainly confusing unintended consequences announcement, where in October last year, there was a high-level synopsis of a long paper that no one's seen that was produced. There was a stock take and talk of phase 2 and lots more consultation on the basis of that. And that stock take wasn't a FATF agreed position and so on. And now we've got a few lines in a statement saying that's all done and we've kicked it into the working group long grass. I just wonder, am I misunderstanding that, or is it sort of vanished somewhere?
That's how we read it as well. So obviously we have the October.
Is it worth a journalist ringing up and asking a few more questions?
You could give it a go. Yeah, okay. Please do. Let us know what they say. I think, but that was always the aspiration, if I'm right. It was always to investigate this issue or these issues and then hand it over to the working groups. So I think it is what we expected. I just would really hope. I think what we really wanted was that it would create a framework for FATF working groups and delegations to always be thinking, when you make a change, what is the unintended consequence that this could have in these 4 areas, but in other areas. So we just hope that within the working groups, that way of thinking has bedded down over the short 12 months period that it has been.
Oh, did you want to address it as well?
Well, just while the microphone is moving across the room, when governments, certainly this government in the UK, introduces new regulations, new laws, there's always kind of an impact assessment that is undertaken. So I guess that's the kind of thing that would be interesting to see.
Thanks. Stephen Reimer, I'm a research fellow at the Centre as well. So I've got a series of questions, but the first one will be about the Unintended Consequences project, just because we're on the subject. I think we were expecting something a bit more than it gets kicked to the working groups. I mean, work that the center has done on this topic has looked at other instruments that exist in similar international fora for like bringing to the attention of that system, kind of unintended consequences or opportunity for redress at the very least. So we do have, an idea of an ombudsperson, where somebody who has been an entity or person who has been adversely affected by the standards could come to FATF ombudsperson and sort of articulate the problem that's happened and for opportunity for redress. So I think there's ideas out there. Some of them come from our center, and we hope that the project doesn't just sort of like atrophy in the working group. So I think at the CFCS, we'll want to continue on it. I've got two questions, one for Tom, and then I suppose one for Isabella. Around the UAE and the UK's illicit finance working sort of partnership with the UAE, I mean, do you think that the UAE is going to be turning to the UK and asking for like intense kind of political support or like practical support in terms of completing action plan items? Like, what do you think the grey listing means for the partnership and for the partnership model that the UK could potentially, apply to other countries in the future? And then maybe a question, maybe for David or for Isabella, whoever feels better placed to answer it. Something we mentioned right at the beginning around the FSRBs and strengthening the network with FSRBs. Could you clarify kind of what that means? I can only infer it means something about kind of like bringing everyone up to scratch in terms of how you conduct mutual evaluations and quality of assessments, and perhaps it's information sharing between them. I'm not quite sure, but a bit of kind of more kind of insight on that would be really helpful.
Okay, first, the UAE. So I think it's important to acknowledge that the UK government has invested a lot of time, effort, jet fuel, and everything else in building the relationship with the UAE on illicit financing. The UAE is a kind of recognized threat from a UK perspective, and I think the UK, as far as I can tell, has done a kind of good job of trying to work with the UAE since its mutual evaluation was published, and indeed before that. So I'd be disappointed if this partnership foundered on the grey listing. I certainly imagine that if you're in the embassy in Abu Dhabi at the moment, you probably got some interesting conversations to have. But there are some, I think, quite strong links between UK and UAE on illicit finance, or responding to illicit finance, or both actually. And so I would kind of expect us to work through that. I think where there is going to be a bigger challenge is for the UK private sector, which will, by law, have to respond to the grey listing. And some of that response is a response that the private sector will not want to take, and might lead to de-risking and all the things that we are familiar with when it comes to heightened risk. So I think the bigger challenge actually will be for the private sector. I suspect that the relationships that HMG and the UAE authorities have are strong enough to work through this.
What was the second part of the question?
The FSRB network.
Yeah, so this is really important because the UN recently convened a panel under the direction of the General Assembly. It's called the FACTI panel, F-A-C-T-I, I forget what it stands for. But it basically looked at illicit finances generally and corruption, but FATF with taxes, FATF was part of it. And it criticized FATF for not being inclusive enough. Because the people who make the decisions around standards are the 39 member countries. But of course, it affects 205 jurisdictions around the world. And so the implication was all those jurisdictions don't have a strong enough say in the things that have a massive impact on them. And so FATF needs to do more about it. Now, I think what I hope this vision of strategy, global strategy, will provide is a way of including those countries more through their regional bodies, their FATF style regional bodies, as they're called. That's difficult because they're all very different. There are some bodies in Africa that are crying out for help and just want to be told what to do. There are other bodies, for example, in Asia and in Europe, that are good bodies, and they're more partners and equal partners, and on a more of a level playing field with the FATF. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and whatever the FATF come up with, it needs to work with the different parts of the world to ensure it understands and their concerns, the challenges they face, and that their voices are heard.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I would also just urge our audience to check out a paper that we recently published back in February, assessing the different practical challenges of the mutual evaluation process, which does cover some of the issues with FSRBs. As David said, they're all at different stages of maturity. They do absolutely excellent work around the world. But I think for those countries that are the FSRBs that are perhaps calling out for more support, we need to give it to them. Now, that doesn't come from we FATF, it comes probably from FATF member states giving greater budgets and resources to these areas that want more help. I would always say like secondment models could be really cool, but at the same time, you'll be taking really talented people out of areas of the world where they might not have a replacement. So there's lots of room, I think, for the FATF member states, but also for the donor community to better support the FSRB network going forward. And as I said at the beginning, they haven't said in the statement whether or not there will be anything published on that strategic vision. It would be great if there was something published on it.
So we have a question online for David. Do you think that the revisions to recommendation 24, I'm not sure which one it is, are just tinkering around the edges, or will they make a material difference to identification of beneficial ownership?
So recommendation 24 is the FATF speak for the requirement for countries to have up-to-date, accurate and timely information on who ultimately owns and controls companies available to this jurisdiction. And what's just changed about that last week is that instead of saying you can do that in any one of 100 different ways, they've said the preferred method of doing that is through a central registry, such as has been established here in the UK. Now that's good. If that registry contains useful information, there's some validation and verification of the information that goes into it, which at the moment in the UK there isn't. So registries on their own without having that verification are useless. But it is a good step in the right direction. The one caveat I would make is that there is a big loophole in it, where in order to get agreement from every country around the table, some large economies who didn't want to go that far, who didn't agree with registries, insisted on this option of a registry or an alternative mechanism as efficient. And no one knows what that alternative mechanism is or how it would be measured. And I think FATF is due to come out with some guidance to talk more about that. Maybe it'll be about working through public-private partnerships to get that information. Maybe it'll be about the kind of notary system that they have in Spain. If you have one of those, then maybe you don't need a registry, but we'll have to wait and see.
In the UK, is it the Crown dependencies that are sort of resisting this still?
Well, I couldn't speak now for the UK because I've been away for a while, but I don't think it was ever just the Crown dependencies. I think it was as much a domestic issue. Okay. But as I said, the registry is greater in the UK, except for the fact that they didn't go far enough in terms of investigating and validating and verifying what goes into it.
One of the most popular words in Parliament this week has been guff, which one MP has used to refer to the quality of the information in the UK companies registry.
And this is just on legal ownership and beneficial ownership. Yeah.
Right. Well, ownership is very clear on my company. There you go. So we've got a question from Brian Dilly. What do you think banks should do if a non-sanctioned Russian with assets in the UK starts to move their assets into others' names, and there are no suspicions that the assets are the proceeds of crime?
I'll get that one.
Go on.
I think at the moment that I'm going to be very hawkish. I think at the moment there is a moral issue in all of this. People are making decisions on the basis of kind of what is right and what is wrong, as opposed to what is legal and what is not legal. So the way in which companies are suspending their operations in Russia, closing down their businesses and all the rest of it, I think you have to fast forward a year and say, what if I move these assets today? What is that going to look like a year from now if I was the one who moved person XYZ's assets out of the UK and 2 days later they appeared on this hit list that the foreign secretary has. It's a really, really difficult position. I mean, legally, they I guess have to be allowed to move them, but I think if there's somebody who has appeared in the papers for having suspect connections, then I think you have to at least file a suspicious activity report or consult with the National Crime Agency or do something equally.
Do you think there's a retrospective risk from?
I mean, we're in uncharted territory, aren't we? I mean, I have Russian friends in London who I used to work with, who are not able to use their bank account at the moment. There's absolutely nothing inappropriate with them, but the system has just frozen and made it impossible for them to make payments and to move money. So I think it's very difficult.
Doesn't that feed into the kind of human rights issue as well?
It very possibly does. As I said, I'm quite hawkish on this at the moment,
Yeah.
and I think the other issue, of course, is that the rate at which information is coming out of governments around the world is, I guess, it's fast on the one hand, but there are all sorts of kind of shadow boxing going on. There are names that I certainly wouldn't mention online at the moment, who people think should be on lists but aren't yet on lists, but maybe they will be on lists at some point in the future. I think it's very, very difficult to decide what to do. But at the moment, I think you have to decide what is the right thing to do, and maybe not move assets when people ask you to move them.
And Brian is a very senior industry practitioner. He will be aware that in the anti-money laundering sector, you need a bit of a crystal ball, and you constantly need to think about how the actions you take today will be seen in a few years' time by regulators or the authorities, because that tends to be how it's worked in practice in this area.
Any final thoughts?
No, I would just agree.
I think we've got one minute left. Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, absolutely.
From should we go one more? Anyone in the audience? Go on.
Coach from ACAMS. Question related to what we were just discussing around sanctions. I've spoken to some people this week who are a bit less hawkish and who may be a bit concerned about the way in which legislation has rushed through Parliament at the moment, removing the appropriateness test from sanctions rules, as well as introducing strict liability in terms of for OFSI to enforce breaches of sanctions. These the Labour Party has indicated it supports all these measures. So have the Lib Dems, basically, or it's cross-party support for them. But it does seem there's an awful lot of change rushed through at the moment without much scrutiny or debate. And that kind of does relate to, as you pointed out, to the unintended consequences piece, also human rights implications. So I was wondering what the panel thought about that and how that's being dealt with at the moment through Parliament. Very good question. David.
So maybe I'll just start by saying that from my point of view, I think sanctions have always been a political tool. You haven't needed to reach a criminal or even a civil burden of proof to put someone on a sanctions list. I think it was the head of the Director General of the NCA who said recently, she's now retired, that one of the difficulties with the oligarchs and getting to their money is that it's been in the country so long and invested in so many legitimate enterprises. It's really difficult, if not impossible, to trace back to find out if it ever did come from an illegal source. And it's quite possible, in fact, that when they came about their money in Russia at the time, that it wasn't actually illegal. And so you are in this very grey area. And it's, I think it's the difference between illicit finance and money laundering. It's money that we don't like, or activity that we find distasteful rather than necessarily illegal.
I would make a really important point here, because I don't want people to walk away from the room thinking that I've gone mad. I think there is a difference between seizing and confiscating someone's assets and freezing it until you are comfortable that the requested move is acceptable. And so from a personal view, I think some of the proposals and the amendments put forward in Parliament over the last few days around expropriating assets from people, I think that crosses a line. I think freezing assets while you determine whether or not further action should be taken in the current environment, I would say is acceptable. So I think you have to, those are the two issues I think that's the differentiation I would make anyway.
I think that's a really important point. And sorry, is there any?
No.
How much? How much time do we have to be?
Good. Carry on.
We can carry on. Okay. Well, 1 hour, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Because this is a critical point, I think, in the sense of one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. You know, it's such a grey area. And as you rightly say, you've got these unintended consequences, but seizing the property, that is a new element. And we saw that, I think, you know, we've also moved into the central bank domain. I mean, this is beyond, I think, AML and KYC land. But frankly, when you're seizing central bank, assets, we're on a new level entirely. So the hawkish view, what would you say to that?
So I mean, the central bank assets haven't been seized. They've just
not in the case of Russia, but we've
frozen.
had this issue of Afghanistan with the Afghan central bank.
Yeah, so what the Americans have now started to talk about.
They're wanting to redistribute them. So we've crossed that Rubicon, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, I personally felt quite uncomfortable with that decision that they've made in the US. I'm sure it's been kind of thought through, and there are arguments, and I haven't studied it enough. But I think, as I say, I think there is a fundamental difference between expropriating assets from somebody without due process and simply freezing them and saying, we need to just be 100% sure that what you want to do with your money is appropriate. So that I would make that, I would make that distinction as a really important point.
Okay. Any other thoughts on it? No. Should we take one more from online? Let's have a look. Any new ones? What about on unintended consequences specifically, the FATF, AML, CFT, and HR issues? It's difficult to see how the FATF can avoid looking into situations where its standards are being misused, assuming they were. Perhaps FATF cooperation with, this isn't a question, I've just realized. I'll finish the thought though. FATF cooperation with other international agencies discussed at the plenary could be a way to start the conversation to handle the issue. But yes, unless you want to talk on that point whilst I find an actual question. What can a country by country evaluation process bring to illicit financial flows between countries?
Well, one of the things that the mutual evaluation process looks at is international cooperation, and the extent to which countries are cooperating on financial investigations to recover assets from, stolen from one country and finding themselves in another country. But to be honest, the challenge it faces there is if you are a law enforcement practitioner and you're trying to develop a relationship with another country, especially if it's bad and you need it to improve in order to recover assets, you're never going to tell the FATF that the relationship is bad. So it's one of those areas where you've got this quandary. Everyone thinks international cooperation is improving, but you look at the FATF evaluations and it says it's all good. There's no problem here. So it's a challenging thing to actually say something publicly in evaluations, but it is discussed when assessors go to countries and their cooperation with other countries is looked at in great detail.
Now, I think on that, it's interesting to remember the brief life that the first EU high-risk country list had, because that was essentially a list of countries that the EU felt were a threat to it, as opposed to a list of countries that didn't have sufficiently high standards. So there were countries on that list, like if I remember rightly, Saudi Arabia, I think, was on the list, because the EU felt that from Saudi emanated financial crime risk that threatened the EU. And I think that's kind of an interesting lens to apply. A country might have good standards potentially, but if it's exporting financial crime risk to me, then it doesn't matter how good the FATF thinks its standards are, it represents a threat to me. So, I think consensus is going to start breaking down quite quickly.
I mean, just close a question, like if this sort of consensus does break down, I mean, are we looking at a new regime? What like beyond?
What's the future of FATF?
Yeah, exactly. In the context of a potential massive decoupling in the world, is what I like. Imagine two kind of non-interoperable financial systems, which like 2 weeks ago was an absurd thing to say, but I think we're in that realm now.
I mean, I suppose that there is a conversation going on online about whether or not Russia should be removed from FATF as well. I guess the argument is, what is the benefit of removing them? They'll never come back. So,
but it's not just Russia, is it?
No,
because
of course.
There's obviously the other countries that might be sympathetic to Russia.
I guess what is the objective we're trying to achieve? 2 weeks ago, we all wanted to stop financial crime and ensure financial integrity. So if you as a country still want to do that, then FATF is still a relatively good model, gives you a good framework. The peer review process, as we've said, works. So you stay within the system. If you no longer care about meeting those objectives, then maybe FATF isn't for you anymore.
One of the good things about the FATF and the people who've been in it the longest often cite this is that you sit around the table and you have the delegate from the US talking to the delegate from Russia on first name terms. It's not Russia, US, they don't talk to each other as countries. They talk to each other as technical experts. And it, for all the criticism from the UN and others that it's not inclusive, you have not just the 39 countries there, but you have representative of the 9 regional bodies, which represent another 170 odd jurisdictions. You have 20 international organizations from the UN itself to the Egmont Group of Financial Intelligence Units, and they're all involved in the discussions, and they're involved on a first name basis. And you can't underestimate the value of that. So I think, yes, of course, politics comes into it, and there's some bloc politics. Whenever Russia raises the flag, often you'll have Brazil, Russia, India, or India, China will stick their flags up and support. And in the EU, France will raise its flag to object to something, all the EU people will support France.
So it's like the Eurovision song.
So you do have that, but it's better than any other example, I think, in terms of a technical body that is attempting to deal with things on a technical basis. So I think it needs to remain inclusive.
So do you think it can survive the current
friction? I think it will do. I think what will fragment is obviously the global payment system. I mean, it's already fragmenting. That fragmentation will accelerate. But I mean, I guess it's worth noting, at least in my experience, that some of the sort of strongest proponents of things like FATF standards are Russia, right? I mean, so I think it will survive. Whether FATF members, or however it works, I don't know, decide to throw Russia out is another question.
Okay. Do we need to finish now?
I think we should finish.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. That's been really enlightening. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.